when they searched further, they found that there was a cell area that they would keep female captives there for a period of time before killing them.
Charles Ng and Leonard Lake, otherwise known as the Boneyard Killers.
One of the women, she had a little baby, and on the video she is repeatedly distraught and asking, "What have you done with my baby? Where's my baby?"
Hi, I'm Nick from True Crime Uncut. Welcome to Questions With. This week we're speaking with a former inspector at the San Francisco Police Department, Ed Erdelatz.
I was in the homicide detail, and I was aware of the fact that there were a couple of missing persons cases that were kind of unusual. And I just knew that from having read them in the newspaper. One was this Dubs family, a family of three, were missing under very strange circumstances. And people go missing all the time, but for a story to make the newspaper in San Francisco, there has to be something a little different or unusual about it, and that was certainly the case with the Dubs family. And the same with Paul Cosner. Paul Cosner was a man who lived in the Marina District in San Francisco, last seen alive when he purportedly left the house to show a prospective buyer of his car to take them for a test drive. And he was never seen again. So again, those cases were kind of in the back of my mind. Leonard Lake and Ng had attempted to shoplift a Vice. Ng ran away. Lake stayed and tried to talk his way out of the shoplifting incident. And the South San Francisco police officer went to the car to recover the Vice and also found a .22 pistol in the back. Subsequently found out that the car had switched license plate, and the car belonged to Paul Cosner. The missing persons detectives from San Francisco were immediately notified. They went down to South San Francisco, and I believe before they got there, they learned that Leonard Lake had committed suicide by taking a cyanide capsule while he was being interviewed in the South San Francisco Police Department. Before Lake committed suicide at the police station, he volunteered that his crime partner was Charles Ng. The case at that time was assigned to two inspectors from the San Francisco Police Department that were in the missing persons detail, an Inspector Irene Brunn and Tom Eisenman. So at that time, there was still no involvement in homicide, although we had been alerted to the fact that we may be called in at any moment. Irene Brunn and Tom Eisenman went to interview Clara Lynn Balaz, who was Leonard Lake's former wife and the woman he was currently seeing. She lived a short distance from the lumber yard where Lake and Ng had attempted to shoplift a Vice. When Inspectors Brunn and Eisenman went to talk to Clara Lynn Balaz, she informed them that she and Lake were divorced. She claimed really not to know anything about where Charles Ng may be or of any of the criminal activity that they may have been involved in. Irene Brunn and Tom Eisenman found out through her that there was a cabin up in the mountains that Lake sometimes frequented, and they asked her to accompany them up to the cabin. And she told them that she would, but she said she had to make funeral arrangements, and it would be some time, a day or two before she would go, but she'd be glad to take them up there. So really, they had no choice at that point. They couldn't force her to go up there, and she explained to them that the cabin was in a very remote location. It would be very difficult for them to find without her to point it out. So now we jump 2 days later, and Tom Eisenman and Irene Brunn went up to the cabin with Clara Lynn Balaz. And as they were going through the cabin, Irene Brunn noticed a VCR and some other electronic equipment that she thought resembled equipment that was missing from the Dubs home. And she ran the serial number of a couple of those items, and sure enough, she got a hit. So she knew at that point, not only had she linked Lake and Ng to Paul Cosner in the car, but now she'd linked them into yet another missing person, the Dubs family. At that point, Clara Lynn Balaz told them that she wanted them to leave the property, and at that time, they shut things down, got a search warrant. Until the missing persons investigators got to the cabin, there was no connection to the Dubs family. So once that link was established, then there were, connection to 4 probably murdered people, and turns out that did prove to be the case. So at that point, the case was transferred from missing persons to homicide. So my partner, Jeff Brosh, and I ended up heading up a team of probably about 20 investigators from San Francisco. Well, one of the things they found shortly after is several drums, plastic drums that had been buried on the property. And they contained another weapon, another pistol, a lot of ammunition, and several videotapes. And when the Calaveras detectives and the San Francisco police missing persons people viewed the video, then yet there was another shock. Now we have on film a number of individuals who are being held captive, and they're being interrogated by Lake and by Ng. Several of the women are made to disrobe. They're told they will cooperate or they'll be killed. One of the women lived in the adjacent property, Brenda O'Connor. She had a little baby, and on the video she is repeatedly distraught and asking Leonard Lake and Charles Ng, "What have you done with my baby? Where's my baby?" It's very difficult to watch. And she's told that her baby's at a better place. She said, "What does that mean?" And they don't, of course, they don't explain that. And at one point you can see Charles Ng walk into the scene where he's actually on film too, and he has this .22 pistol that he threatens her with. Leonard Lake is doing most of the talking, but Charlie Ng does do some of the talking, and he appears in the video. Then there's another video of another young woman who had been abducted. Her boyfriend was somebody that Ng knew previously, and they set up a meeting, presumably, I believe it was to do drugs or something, and abducted this other gal, Kathy Allen. It's clear that Lake is the one that's giving the instructions and telling Charlie what to do. And if Charlie doesn't do it something quick enough, Lake kind of takes him to task, and you can see that he's kind of impatient, very impatient with Charlie. Lake, I believe, again, was calling most of the shots, but Ng was a very willing participant. It's just that he didn't vocalize things as much as Lake. Lake was the talker. Charlie was always very quiet. He was just a guy that pretty much kept to himself, a real loner. Also on the property was a bunker, and it was made out of cinder block, and it was built into the side of the hill. And when you entered the bunker, there was like a workshop and a tool where areas where tools were and so on, but the detectives from Calaveras found that there was a false wall. And when they searched further, they found that there was a cell area that had been built into the back of the bunker, that they would keep female captives there for a period of time before killing them. Also in the bunker were a number of pictures, photographs of young women. And we spent a lot of time trying to identify these young women. There was also, in addition to the videos, there was a journal or a diary that Leonard Lake had kept. Some of it was handwritten and some of it was typed, and there were periods of times where he would skip recording certain dates. But from those dates that he recorded, we found out that there were yet more victims and more crimes. Many of these crimes were referred to in code, and we were trying to figure out, for a long period of time, we focused on trying to identify what Leonard Lake, when he was referring to, when he was talking about different ops, he would code name a different planned killings or crimes. One, as an example, was Fish, Operation Fish, and we finally determined that in addition to the women that Lake and Ng had kidnapped and raped, there was a crime, several murders that Leonard Lake had committed before he and Charles Ng hooked up for their 11-month crime spree. So his case just kept getting bigger and bigger. We found out that Operation Fish was the murder of Leonard Lake's best man when he married Clara Lynn Balazs in 1981. And he talked about the frustration of trying to complete Operation Fish, the murder of his best man. Several years later, we did find Charles Gunnar's body up on the property, and it was when a phone company or PG&E crew came through doing work that some of their equipment unearthed Charles Gunnar's grave. It became a huge story. For the most part, the press kind of camped out up in Calaveras, up in San Andreas, which is the county seat in Calaveras. I think all the hotel rooms were taken, and there was media from all over the world. We later learned that she went up to the cabin almost immediately. We also found out that she drove Charlie Ng from her house to his apartment in San Francisco, later took him to the airport, and he flew out to Chicago. None of this did she share with us. Well, one of the things that we did, it was kind of broken up into areas. My partner, Jeff Brosh, pretty much stayed up in Calaveras, and he worked with the detectives up there. And what they were doing at that point was uncovering a lot of evidence that had been buried. We know, of course, the videos and the gun and the journals had been buried. We have the false wall in this bunker. And they up there began to dig, and they began finding more bodies, and they found other evidence that had been buried. I pretty much stayed in San Francisco, and Inspector Irene Brunn and I teamed up, and we were meeting with Clara Lynn Balazs on a regular basis, and she was helping us to understand what Lake was referring to in the diary when he was giving some of these criminal activities different names. We worked with her, I believe it was for about 8 or 9 days, extensively. We also had photographs that we showed her of different properties up in Calaveras, trying to find out if she knew where Leonard and Charles Ng may have buried some of the bodies, that type of thing.
Following her interview with the police, Clara Lynn Balazs hired an attorney and gave no more interviews. Clara Lynn's attorney asked for blanket immunity, which she was granted in exchange for her agreeing to testify against Charles Ng. Police were unable to prove that Clara Lynn had any involvement in the horrors that occurred in their remote California cabin.
I believe that was approximately 11 or 12. We believe that there were probably 17 or more murders that Leonard Lake and Charles Ng committed as a team. Dr. Boyd Stevens, who was the coroner in San Francisco, was also extremely helpful. He came up to Calaveras County and assisted the deputies up there in mapping out and plotting the property, trying to locate more bodies. There was a chicken coop on the property. We later found another body in the chicken coop. There was also the PG&E, or the phone company, had been through at some point, and they were digging a phone trench. And the earth, although they covered it back up, the earth was still not really hard. And what Lake and Ng did is they buried all the contents of their neighbor's cabin in the trench and covered it up. They wanted the authorities to think that Brenda O'Connor, who was the woman with her baby, and her boyfriend and a friend, Scott Stapley, had just left the area and moved on. So to make it appear that they had moved on, they buried the contents of most of their cabin in this trench. So it was a very time-consuming digging and unearthing property and documenting it and exactly where was it located, what was it, who did it belong to. So that took a tremendous amount of time. Very hot up there at that time too, in July, over 100 degrees. One of the things that the detectives up in Calaveras were finding a lot of were little small bone chips that had previously been burned. We believe they had a big bonfire. So in some of the cases, it was hard to definitely determine what the exact cause of death was because the bodies had been so badly burned and chopped up. The young women whose pictures were in the bunker were all identified, and they were okay. We found out that Leonard Lake often took pictures of young high school girls. They had some connection with the high school up there. They would take pictures, And we found out that many of those were pictures from young women up in that area. No harm had come to them. It took a long time and a lot of work involved. In the meantime, again, we're still looking for Ng. So there was a lot going on. Leonard Lake and Charles Ng first became acquainted back, I believe it was around 1983. At that time, Charles Ng was a fugitive. He had escaped from a Marine brig in Hawaii, came to California, met up with Leonard Lake, and they were committing crimes together. But insofar as we know, they didn't commit any murders. We did find one young woman that they'd abducted and raped, but they let her go. And an FBI SWAT team came in by helicopter and arrested Charles Ng, being a fugitive. They also arrested Leonard Lake for having a number of firearms in the cabin that he shouldn't have had. And then Lake was sent to Leavenworth Prison, and when he got out of prison, he returned to California, and that's when they began this 11-month crime spree of murder and rape. Leonard Lake, when he became a fugitive initially, it was really for a very minor offense in the whole scope of things. And to listen to him on some of these videos, you would think that, if he was caught, he was going to go to jail for the rest of his life. Very impressed with himself, and as we know, very calculating, very evil guy. In the one video, it's like a monologue. I've talked about the earlier videos when they have the women that they've abducted. But there's one video when he's sitting in his easy chair. It's like the fireside chat with the president. And he seems very relaxed, and he leans back in his chair, and he talks for almost a half hour about what his plans are, his plans to abduct women. And he says, I don't know. I don't know if I'll get away with this or not, but I'm going to try. And he also makes it clear that he doesn't plan on being arrested, that this is going to be his game plan. So that's just yet another very bizarre aspect about this case, where he lays out his whole game plan on film. These guys had a varied MO. Sometimes the motive for their crime was to hold a woman for sex. Other times it was robbery for financial gain. It wasn't just one thing. It wasn't just that we were looking for missing women. It could have been anything. They would sometimes lure people from San Francisco up to the property. And some of these were homeless types. They'd get them up there on the pretext of giving them some kind of work or giving them some marijuana. And then they would kill them and then began to collect their Social Security type benefits. They would require these people to force them to write to relatives saying that they were leaving the area so they wouldn't be reported missing. And also in writing to, say, Social Security and having their check sent to a post office box. And then Lake and Ng were cashing these checks and using that money. Other times it was burglaries. In the case of the Dubs family, they took all of their photographic equipment. Mr. Dubs used to do photography work on the side. They abducted his wife and raped her. Cosner, it was to steal his car. So you never knew with these guys. On another case, and this was the one murder that occurred in San Francisco, Ng responded to an ad in a homosexual publication. He went to this individual's house in San Francisco for the purpose of having sex with this other fellow. The plan, however, was that Charlie Ng was going to kill this individual, and Leonard Lake, who was waiting around the corner, would drive up in the car, and they would empty out the house, much like they did with the Dubs family. And Ng shoots him through the top of the head and kills him. Unbeknownst to Ng, or Lake, the roommate was home, and he came running downstairs when he heard the shot. So Ng shot him, but he survived, and then they fled without taking any of the property. So that's the one murder that occurred in San Francisco. But here, talking again about different kinds of MO. Here's a homosexual man that's shot in his home. How does that link up with some of these other crimes when you're looking for MOs? law enforcement does. What are the similarities? Well, there was nothing that would tie that to some of these others. Going into the house, taking a man's car for a test drive, luring people up to the cabin, and then killing them and assuming their identities. So many different MOs that was difficult to put it all together, and certainly unusual. In the meantime, we're working with the FBI and Interpol, trying to find out where he may have gone. We're trying to find other associates and crime partners that they may have been in jail with. Anybody that could give us any information on Charles Ng. He had a sister who lived in the Bay Area. His sister was interviewed and her family by the FBI and other investigators. So at that point, it's kind of twofold. We're trying to find Charles Ng, but at the same time, we're trying to develop more evidence, and we're trying to find more bodies. And we never did find, as an example, Paul Cosner's body. We believe he was buried up in Calaveras County, maybe not on that property. Based upon information one of his associates had given to the FBI, we felt he probably had gone across the border up into Canada. So his picture was being distributed up there. Again, this is a case that got a lot of publicity throughout the country and up in Canada. And we found out that Ng was living in a park. He had gone into a big department store up in Calgary. He was shoplifting, much like he had done at the lumber yard. And a couple of store detectives approached him, and he was armed, and he pulled out his gun and shot one of the store clerks. He was arrested. He was sentenced to several years in prison up in Canada. During that time, we had requested the Canadian authorities to extradite him when he finished his sentence up in Canada. And that was the process that took so long. We went up to Canada, myself and one of the Calaveras detectives. I sat down with him in the detention facility up in Calgary. And we did most of the talking. We were attempting to get Ng to talk with us, but he wouldn't. We were hoping that since Lake was dead, that he would have taken that as an opportunity to kind of put it on Lake. And at least that would have gotten him talking. But he never did. The evidence was so overwhelming. When you consider the fact that you had him on film with a number of the victims telling them that he was going to kill them, along with all of the other evidence that was found, it was a pretty rock-solid case. I remember I went up to Canada to testify in his extradition hearing. The Mounties had him in court, and Ng was purportedly to be a martial arts expert. Whether he was or not, I don't know. But so the Mounties and the authorities in California, whenever he would come in court, he was manacled and so on. But interestingly enough, up in Canada, the Mounties had a canine officer with his big German Shepherd that sat right next to Charles Ng during the entire proceeding, which I thought was interesting. Canada had a provision in the law that if the country requesting extradition had a death penalty, they did not have to grant extradition. So he played that card for a long time, and eventually the Canadian authorities released him to the United States without requiring the U.S. to waive the death penalty as a possibility. It took a long time, about 4 years, 3 or 4 years. All of this property that was unearthed, that had been buried, the contents of almost an entire cabin for one, I think more than I've ever seen in any other case. We're talking about so many different murders over a period of time. It was a kind of a culmination of an awful lot of work. So the initial frustration was getting him back. Then there was the frustration of all of these continuances he kept getting. And of course, this was it was a very expensive proposition here. I think that at that time it was the most expensive prosecution in the history of California. It was well over $25 million. And there was a change of venue, and it was tried down in Orange County. Ng was very stoic, showed very little emotion, would rarely make eye contact. I went down to Orange County and testified, And he never made eye contact with me, and I never saw him really make eye contact with anybody else. He just kind of looked down the entire time. I don't think he was ever any remorse. Hard to figure. He did not testify in his own behalf. He was given the death penalty. He's now in San Quentin on death row. When, if ever that ever happens, is anybody's guess. But that's where he is. At the time, Ronald Reagan was president of the United States. Berlin Wall was up, Soviet Union was intact, and O.J. Simpson and Nicole Brown were newlyweds. Goes back a long time, but I spent 23 years of my career in homicide, worked a lot of murder cases, a lot of serial killings as well, but this is right at the top of the list of being a case that we'll never forget and put right up there as one of the most difficult also to deal with personally. I think any law enforcement officer will tell you, after a while you become, I don't know that you become used to it, but you become somewhat hardened, I guess. But when you're dealing with small children or babies, it always is really difficult. And when you see people who are in no way involved in any kind of criminal activity themselves, that are just innocent people in their home trying to sell their car and taken advantage of and abducted, and then you see the horror that they go through when you actually see it on video. You could imagine it, what they must have gone through, but then to actually see a woman begging for her baby and asking for her baby, that's very unusual and very difficult to deal with.
Charles Ng was convicted of 11 murders, including 2 infants, 3 women and 6 men. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection in 1999 and remains on death row at San Quentin Prison. The Calaveras Cold Case Task Force are still trying to identify more victims whose remains were found in and around Lake's remote cabin. We hope you enjoyed this interview with former Homicide Inspector Ed Erdelatz on his role in the Leonard Lake and Charles Ng investigation. If you'd like to see more videos like this with other detectives on the world's most infamous killers, then please subscribe and give us a thumbs up below. Let us know in the comments which killer you'd like us to cover in the future. I'm Nick from True Crime Uncut. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.